Thank you for that introduction. Hello, everyone. My name is Bob Gaines, and I'm the Deputy Director for the Office of Program and Regulatory Operations, also known as OPRO, within the Office of Pharmaceutical Quality, also known as OPQ. I'm excited for the opportunity to discuss best practices and strategies for communicating with the agency about your applications. OPQ plays a large role in the assessment and final action for all applications. We utilize a team-based approach to perform the quality assessment for the application. Our team collaborates throughout the assessment cycle to identify opportunities to provide you with feedback. Today, we will review the various OPQ communications issued during the ANDA assessment cycle. We will also review best practices for communicating with OPQ, and finally, we will provide resources to expand in more detail on the points discussed. The Quality Assessment Team in OPQ consists of assessors from various scientific disciplines and also a Regulatory Business Process Manager, or RBPM. The RBPM should always be your primary point of contact for all OPQ-related communications internally and for industry as well. The RBPM works closely with the assessment team to monitor the progress of our assessment and to facilitate internal meetings. The RBPMs also issue all communications related to the quality assessment during the assessment cycle. Information request letters, or IRs, are used to request clarification or additional information to continue with the assessment that will be helpful to allow for completion of our review. IRs can be issued at any point after the ANDA is acceptable for filing and throughout the assessment cycle. An IR can be a single discipline or multiple disciplines. The IR letter will have a requested response date and can be communicated by letter, email, and/or by telephone. Discipline Review Letter, or DRL, represents the preliminary findings by the discipline issued by the mid-cycle date. Because they are preliminary, they will reflect input from the assessment team, but not input from all supervisory levels. If there are no deficiencies identified by the mid-cycle date, you would still get a letter that would be a no comments DRL. Like the IR, the DRL will also include a requested response date. Challenge question number 1. You've just received a quality-related information request from OPQ. There is a comment that you are unclear about. Who should you contact first? A. Dr. Mike Kopcha, Director for Office of Pharmaceutical Quality. B. The Regulatory Project Manager, or the RPM, in the Office of Generic Drugs. C. The Regulatory Business Process Manager, or the RBPM, in OPQ. Or D. The Drug Product Assessor, also in OPQ. The correct answer is C. The Regulatory Business Process Manager, or RBPM, in OPQ. Don't forget, the RBPM is your primary point of contact for all quality-related issues and inquiries. Best practices. The purpose of the IR and DRL are to maintain communication throughout the assessment process and to increase predictability and transparency. Now I will discuss some best practices to consider when communicating with OPQ. Responses to IR and DRLs need to be complete and submitted in a timely manner. When submitting your response, every deficiency and comment communicated needs to be addressed. For example, if you receive 8 comments, you should have 8 responses. We cannot honor commitments to address the comments later. This would be a partial response and would not be accepted. The assessment of the response will not take place until it is complete and addresses all of the comments or deficiencies sent in the IR or DRL. The response also needs to be submitted by the response date identified on the IR or DRL. If the response is submitted after the requested date, it will be considered a late response and may impact the goal date. Additionally, if a complete response is ready to be issued, the late response could be deferred until the next assessment cycle. Finally, only respond with the requested information. Any gratuitous information may impact the assessment times and goal dates. What should you do if you need an extension for your response? If you can't respond by the requested date, request an extension as soon as possible with your RBPM. The RBPM and the Quality Assessment Team will determine if an extension can be granted. There are multiple factors taken into consideration for extension requests. Those factors include the requested amount of time, how much time remains on the assessment clock, and the status of other disciplines. Multiple extension requests are not recommended. If you do request an extension, be sure to request an ample amount of time for you to completely respond by the requested date. The next couple of slides will discuss other items for you to consider when communicating with us. Clearly outline all OPQ subdisciplines impacted by the submission. This will prevent any delays in getting all necessary disciplines assigned in a timely manner. Actively communicate with your Drug Master File holder, or DMF. This is particularly important for you both to be aware of submission timing. DMF submissions can impact the ANDA goal date. Next, be sure that all current facilities, including relevant DMF facilities, along with their responsibilities, are clearly listed on the 356H form. If all of the facilities are not listed but later discovered during the assessment cycle, this could have a negative impact on the outcome and timing of the application action. For supplements, be sure that your cover letter clearly indicates the type of change that's being submitted. This will aid in the efficient triage of the application and allow all necessary assessors to be assigned early in the assessment cycle. For group supplements, please be mindful that requesting changes to one application in the group could impact all applications in the group. For example, requesting to withdraw one application could inadvertently withdraw the entire group if the cover letter was not clear. Finally, be sure that you are using a secure email address to ensure timely communications. If you need to request a secure email, the address can be found here. Challenge question 2. Which of the following is true? A. Sending partial responses to IR/DRLs has no impact on goal dates. B. You do not need to communicate with the DMF holder after the application is acceptable for filing. C. Facility responsibilities don't need to be on the 356H. Or D. Having a secure email will ensure timely communication. The correct answer is D. Remember that the secure email is necessary for us to send you written electronic communications in the fastest manner possible. In summary, the RBPM is your first point of contact for all quality-specific inquiries. I can't stress this enough. When inquiries are sent to more senior level leadership, they always come back to the RBPM to provide input and oftentimes to respond to that inquiry. Next, don't forget to completely respond to all communications from OPQ by the requested due date. Also, be familiar with the assessment timelines and quality communication time points throughout the assessment cycle. Finally, if I haven't already mentioned this, reach out to your RBPM for all quality-related communications. We have a mutual interest in fewer review cycles and more approvals. We can achieve that by effectively communicating with each other throughout the assessment process. There are several following slides with links to various resources that you guys can use at your disposal. I look forward to continuing to collaborate with you all and to provide safe and effective medications to the American public. Thank you all for all that you do, and thank you for allowing me to participate.
Hello, my name is Lieutenant Warren Simmons, and I am a Senior Regulatory Project Manager in the Office of Generic Drugs at the Food and Drug Administration, and I have the pleasure of presenting today on the strategies for communicating with the FDA. I do have some learning objectives for today's presentation, and they are first to address some commonly seen issues, next to review some best practices, then to provide tips for success, and lastly, to provide resources for applicants. The topics that we will cover today are as follows. We will go over cover letters, requests for prioritization, tentative approval to final approval, patent history, and lastly, deferred submissions. So starting with cover letters. The primary purpose of the cover letter is to summarize the contents of the submission, to identify the purpose of the submission, also to highlight the key elements of the submission, to provide required regulatory statements, and for us at the FDA, one of the most important purposes of the cover letter is to help route and manage the submission effectively. Now we'll go over some strategies and best practices for communication with regard to cover letters. Before we get started, I would like to remind you that the following are FDA recommendations, and although they are not requirements, they greatly assist in the triaging and management of your applications. While FDA does provide some guidance for cover letters, the applicant must also tailor their cover letter to meet their specific needs and regulatory requirements. So first up, make sure to provide regulatory description of the submission, including appropriate regulatory information. Next, highlight significant elements of your submission in the beginning of your cover letter. Place those major changes in the beginning to increase visibility. By making sure major changes aren't buried in the content of the cover letter, this helps ensure that this information isn't missed and subsequently doesn't cause any delays to the review of the submission. Also, make sure all required components are included. Components such as MMA verification statements, which are required, can cause a delay in the issuance of an action letter if they are missing, specifically the issuance of approval and tentative approvals, which neither applicants nor us at the agency likes to happen. This next bullet somewhat goes back to bullet 2, but please include all new or major changes in the header, whether it's new labeling or a new strength. Make sure you let us know in the cover letter. And our last bullet on this slide is separating each item into its own paragraph. This is another strategy that helps us at the agency to be able to weed out what is actually included in the submission. Okay, we will continue with more strategies with regard to the cover letter. Be concise, especially if more detail is provided within other modules. Some applicants choose to include a lengthy breakdown of each module in the cover letter, whereas others opt for a briefer description. Regardless of the format you choose, again, please make sure you are very clear about what information is included in your submission and where it can be located. Use keywords rather than vague and lengthy descriptions of content. Certain phrases like reformulation should be used instead of saying changes to the composition of the product, which is vague and does not help in the triaging of the submission to the appropriate review teams. Become familiar with the types of changes that can affect the review of your application and ensure those changes are always communicated on your cover letter. And bold the text of any administrative requests that are combined with data submitted for review. Key phrases like request for reconsideration should be bolded, especially if they are included in the body of the cover letter. Again, the cover letter should help guide the FDA on how to route your submission for appropriate review. Our last and relatively newest recommendation for communication with regards to cover letters is to utilize the cover letter attachment checklist found in cover letter attachments for controlled correspondences and ANDA submissions draft guidance for industry. This guidance is intended to assist prospective and current applicants of abbreviated new drug applications with optional attachments that can be used when preparing cover letters that accompany original ANDAs, amendments to ANDAs, and supplements to approved ANDAs submitted to the FDA. These attachments do not replace the recommendations for the content of cover letters provided in other FDA guidances and have been designed as a checklist to reflect common types of information applicants are expected to address in the cover letter for their submission. Please note that these checklists are not an exhaustive list of the information needed from applicants. Also, there may be additional items that need to be submitted with the application, for example, information related to patents and exclusivities. Applicants are not required to submit an attachment with their cover letter. However, the optional checklist attachment can be a useful guide to help applicants prepare their cover letters. All right, now it is time to take a quick break for our first challenge question. True or false? Use of the FDA cover letter template is required for each submission. All right, if you picked false, that is the correct answer. While there are components of the cover letter template that are required for each submission, the use of the template itself is not required, but is highly recommended in order to help facilitate the efficient triage of each submission for review. Okay, now we will go over some tips for success and best practices when requesting prioritization of a submission. First, explicitly request priority at the time of submission to include the prioritization factors for which the submission qualifies. In the absence of an explicit request, FDA will only grant priority if it determines that the submission relates to a drug shortage, public health emergency, or that the submission meets the requirements of Section 505J 11A of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Next, make sure to request priority review with each submission. If an applicant's request for a priority review is granted upon the initial submission, however, they don't also request priority with subsequent submissions such as CR responses, those later submissions will not be given priority review. Make sure to clearly state priority review requested and reference the ANDA number in the cover letter to the submission. And also include sufficient supporting documentation for the request. Now we'll go over some strategies for communication when requesting final approval after an application has been tentatively approved. To begin, clearly state request for final approval in the cover letter and provide adequate documentation showing the application will be eligible for final approval. In addition, clearly identify all new or major changes or labeling updates since tentative approval was granted. I know this may sound kind of redundant, however, we just want to make sure any preventable delays are being addressed in a timely manner. Okay, and with that said, after submitting your request for final approval, please continue to monitor for any RLD updates, any newly listed product-specific guidances, or unsolicited DMF amendments to your application, as these may also cause a delay in the issuance of an action letter. If any questions arise during the review process, please don't hesitate to contact your regulatory project manager or RPM for your specific application. And lastly, we recommend utilizing the ANDA submissions, amendments, and requests for final approval to tentatively approved ANDAs guidance for industry as a helpful resource. This next slide is specifically for applications that are affected by any patents or legal restrictions. Please remember to submit any litigation information in a timely fashion. Unfortunately, I've seen instances where an application looked good from a review standpoint. However, prior to clearance, we had to reach out to the applicant to request information related to litigation, and this caused a delay in meeting the goal date. So in that case, whereas a patent amendment submitted earlier would not have affected the goal date, because we had to search and request for the information, a delay was ultimately created. Open communication with the RPM is also strongly encouraged and assists us in planning for any foreseeable issues, which we hope will ultimately prevent delays later on, especially as we get closer to the goal date. Lastly, creating a table that chronologically describes patents or exclusivity information, especially for those applications affected by a long list of patents, is both helpful and encouraged. Now for the final agenda item, we will discuss communication strategies for deferred submissions. As a reminder, FDA may defer assessment of an unsolicited amendment if the discipline assessments are close to completion and either the submitted amendment contains a significant amount of new information to be assessed, or the amendment is submitted after the relevant assessments have been completed and while an IR, DRL, or CR is being prepared. This discretion to assess or defer such amendments enables FDA to timely assess all GDUFA submissions. Generally, amendments submitted during closed cycle will be reviewed upon receipt of complete response or a request for final approval. Therefore, if you have unsolicited information to include in your application and it is in closed cycle, it will likely not be reviewed until you respond to the CR or a request for final approval is received by the agency. In addition, if there is any uncertainty regarding a submission during a closed cycle or near the GDUFA goal date, please contact the RPM for any guidance. Okay, now it's time for our second challenge question of the presentation. Which of the following can potentially cause a delay to the issuance of an action letter? A, RLD updates. B, newly issued product-specific guidance. C, unsolicited DMF amendment. Or D, all of the above. If you selected D, all of the above, that is correct. As we went over earlier, all of these possible updates may potentially cause a delay, which is why, again, it is important to continually monitor and stay up to date with your specific application. Here I've provided some very helpful resources that you can use to review in case you have any additional questions about communicating with FDA. And here are some additional guidances that were referenced during the presentation. So in conclusion, I would just like to say, please continue to submit high quality submissions in which there is a thorough explanation of the contents. Please share information with your RPMs and discipline PMs so that we can help navigate the best path forward and hopefully get your applications to a desired outcome. And lastly, let's continue working together to get as many applications approved as possible and hopefully bringing down the cost of healthcare for the American public. This concludes my presentation, and I would just like to thank you all for your time and attention during my portion. Thank you again, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Peter Enos, and I am a filing primer reviewer within the Division of Filing Review. Today I'll be presenting an overview of common deficiencies found during the filing review, as well as best practices to substantially complete ANDAs for applicant submissions. Later in this presentation, my colleague, Elizabeth Kim, will be presenting some best practices for submitting controlled correspondences. Learning objectives today will include refuse to receive statistics, common major deficiencies that may lead to an RTR, common minor deficiencies which may lead to an information request, ANDA submission considerations, communications with DFR project managers, and a complete overview of controlled correspondences. So let's get a baseline of the impact RTRs have had for the industry. Since 2018, DFR has had a year-over-year reduction in overall total RTRs. In fact, in fiscal year 2021, DFR only refused 38 ANDAs, one of the lowest amounts of RTRs since 2018. We attribute this reduction to increased transparency with industry, optimizing our filing review practices, and improving communication with our applicants. So starting with major deficiencies, the following is an overview of some common major deficiencies from fiscal year 2021, and these include the stability data, Q1, Q2 sameness to the RLD, dissolution studies, justification of impurities, bioequivalent studies, and inactive ingredient justifications. So let's get started. For stability data, it's imperative to provide at least 3 test batches using 2 API lots of each strength. The data should include 6 months worth of both accelerated and long-term data with 3 time points. If a significant change or failure of any attribute occurs in the accelerated study, then an intermediate study should be conducted while continuing the accelerated study to 6 months, even if failure is detected. Stability data should also incorporate orientation that includes both the worst case and the non-worst case scenarios. Additionally, the stability start and pull dates should be clearly defined for all batches and time points. For Q1, Q2 sameness to the RLD, please ensure that parenteral drug products contain the same inactive ingredients and in the same concentration as the RLD. Exception excipients are permitted, and these include preservatives, buffers, or antioxidants. Ophthalmic or otic drug products must also contain the same inactive ingredients and in the same concentration as the RLD. Exception excipients such as preservatives, buffers, substances to adjust tonicity, or thickening agents may differ from the RLD except for in ophthalmic drug products. This is because in ophthalmic drug products, applicants may not change a buffer or substance to adjust tonicity for the purpose of claiming a therapeutic advantage over or difference from the RLD. If an applicant is submitting a deviation of Q1, Q2 from the RLD, then an appropriate in vivo BE study should be provided. Please refer to the listed regulation for more details. DFR recommends applicants to follow the dissolution studies from the product-specific guidance, which can be obtained in FDA's Dissolution Methods database. For drug products that are modified release or functionally scored, half-tablet dissolution studies should be submitted. Additionally, comparative dissolution studies should include 12 dosage units of each strength of both test product and RLD. For justification of impurities, the acceptance criteria should not exceed the qualification threshold for identified impurity or degradation products. The AC should also not exceed the identification threshold for unidentified impurity or degradation products. If the AC should exceed either the QT or the IT, then justification and supportive data should be provided in the submission. For unspecified impurities, AC should not exceed IT, and an applicant should not cite USB exclusively as a justification per the impurities RTR guidance. DFR recommends that the BE study data should be provided in the recommended tabular format, and applicants should follow the model BE data summary tables as outlined in DFR's checklist. Additionally, the long-term storage stability should exceed the sample storage duration. Within the LTSS tables, as well as tables 10 and 4, data should be consistent with the information provided in the Module 5 reports. Inactive ingredient justification of oral liquids should be justified on a per dosage unit based on RLD dosing information in the labeling. Justifications should also be performed on the same route of administration. If a drug product includes flavoring agents, colorants, or fragrances, then each component should be justified. Furthermore, ensure that any drug master file, letters of authorizations, are provided in the submission, as well as composition breakdowns from the manufacturer. So now that we've covered some common major deficiencies from fiscal year 2021, let's look at some common minor deficiencies within each module in the entire ANDA submission. Let's start with Module 1. In Form 356H, please ensure that patent certifications in Field 20, U.S. agent information in Field 6, proposed strengths in Field 13, and DMF numbers in Field 29 is complete. Additionally, the environmental impact analysis statement or a claim of categorical exclusion must be provided. Also in Module 1, all patents currently listed in the Orange Book should be addressed in Module 1.3.5. With respect to the basis of submission, the applicant should also designate the appropriate RLD currently listed in the Orange Book. If referencing an approved suitability petition, the SP docket number and FDA's correspondence approval should also be provided. Other common minor deficiencies in Module 1 pertains to Module 1.14, in which an applicant should include proposed container and carton labels for each strength and each packaging configuration. The SPL format of the package insert should be provided, or provide a commitment to provide proposed labeling in the SPL format. The RLD container and carton labels should be provided for each strength. Note that a comparison may be made to the reference standard only if the RLD labeling is not available. Moving on to Module 2, ensure that separate PDF and Word documents are provided for both Modules 2.3 and 2.7. With respect to Table 5, the applicant should submit all comparative dissolution studies for all strengths and should include the test and reference drug product. Additionally, an exact location of LTSS study reports and data should also be provided in the submission. For Module 3, composition tables in Module 3.2.p.1 should include the proposed formulation in all applicable units, such as % weight per weight, % volume per volume, and % weight per volume. Oral suspensions and oral solutions should include milligrams per dose. We also recommend applicants provide grade, purity, and hydration states, which may include a footnote for water correction as applicable. Also in Module 3, the recommended format for the justification of specification tables should be followed, ensuring that applicants provide separate tables for both specified identified and identified, as well as unspecified impurities. Spectra and chromatograms should also be provided for reference standards and test samples for the drug substance. Lastly, in Module 3, and specifically in Module 3.2.p.8, the withdrawal dates for each time point for all stability studies should be clearly defined in the submission. For our final module, which is Module 5, it is important to list all pilot and/or pivotal studies in Module 5.2, providing adequate study tagging files, as well as providing 20% chromatograms for all analytes of all accepted runs from both the fasting and fed study will ensure that an applicant's submission will be suitable for filing. With respect to the entire ANDA submission, please keep in mind that all documents should have English translations. Common ECTD deficiencies include pages that are not easily legible or not oriented correctly, submissions without adequate or descriptive bookmarks and/or hyperlinks, and documents that are not placed in the correct location. As a quick tip, checking for completeness of all folders, subsections, and leaflets, as well as ensuring there are no duplicate files, are highly recommended. Additionally, contacting CDER eSub for relevant questions prior to submission can be highly beneficial. Lastly, DFR wanted to provide some best practices regarding communication with DFR's project managers. DFR PMs will place a courtesy call to notify of imminent communication. We recommend a secure email and fax number for the U.S. agent in Box 6 of 356H or responsible official in Box 33 of 356H. An alternative contact person can be listed if either of the above officials are not available. So this concludes the ANDA portion of DFR's overview of common deficiencies found during the filing review, as well as some best practices to substantially complete ANDAs for applicant submissions. Thank you so much for taking the time to learn more about DFR, and we look forward to speaking with you during the questions and panel discussion. I'm now going to hand off to my colleague, Elizabeth, to present best practices for submitting control correspondences. Elizabeth?
Thank you. My name is Elizabeth Kim. In this portion of the presentation, I will go over some helpful information related to controlled correspondence submissions reviewed by the Division of Filing Review. A standard controlled correspondence is submitted to the agency by or on behalf of a generic drug manufacturer or related industry to request information on a specific element of generic drug development. The types of standard controlled correspondence inquiries typically reviewed by the Division of Filing Review consist of Q1, Q2 formulation assessment, inactive ingredient justification per unit dose, and filing strategies. FDA's regulations generally require that certain types of proposed drug products be qualitatively and quantitatively the same as the reference listed drug with respect to inactive ingredients pursuant to 314-94A9 3-4. When submitting a Q1, Q2 formulation assessment inquiry, submit no more than 3 formulations of a single drug product. This includes submitting separate Q1, Q2 formulation assessment requests for drug products with multiple strength, because each strength is a separate drug product. Also ensure that the proposed formulation table is clear and unambiguous as possible with adequate details as might be applicable for all inactive ingredients, including salt and hydration forms, purity, grade, type, and function of ingredients. Please note that FDA will not review proposed formulations that are not required by regulations or FDA recommended guidance to be Q1, Q2 the same to the RLD. Continuing on, when submitting a Q1, Q2 formulation assessment request for parenteral drug products, please indicate the total fill volume of the proposed drug product. If a drug product is co-packaged, such as a vial containing lyophilized product and a diluent, include compositions for both lyophilized product and the diluent. Lastly, please include all applicable units for all inactive ingredients in the proposed formulation table. The Division of Filing Review often receives requests asking whether a particular inactive ingredient amount that is at a higher level than the amount listed in the agency's inactive ingredient database is acceptable in generic drug product. FDA recommends that a requester submit no more than 3 inactive ingredients with 1 proposed level of use each, or 1 inactive ingredient with 3 proposed levels of use. Also, please identify the reference listed drug in your controlled correspondence to allow FDA to evaluate the potential acceptability of an inactive ingredient in the context of a specific proposed drug product. The Division of Filing Review also receives controlled correspondence related to filing strategies. An example of a filing strategy inquiry may be asking if multiple strengths of a drug product can be submitted in one single ANDA. The purpose of the controlled correspondence process is to provide a mechanism for the agency's brief and direct response to a particular element of generic drug development. At this time, we have 2 challenge questions. Question number 1. Which of the following is a common ECTD deficiency? Choose all that apply. A. Pages that are not easily legible. B. Pages that are not oriented correctly. C. Submissions without adequate and descriptive bookmarks and/or hyperlinks. D. Documents that are not placed in the correct location. The answers are A, B, C, and D. Question number 2. Which information does not need to be included in the controlled correspondence? A. Fill volume. B. Route of administration. C. Market status of the RLD. D. Estimated ANDA submission time frame. The correct answer is D. The next 2 slides contain references and contact information. Thank you for your participation. We'll be back during the panel Q&A session to answer any questions you may have. Thank you again.
Thank you all for the great presentations. We'll now transition into our Q&A panel. If you haven't had a chance to enter your questions into the Q&A chat pod, please do so now. We'll answer as many questions as time allows. And we welcome back all of our presenters, and we would like to introduce our new panelist, Dr. Julia Lee, who serves as the Deputy Director of the Division of Filing Review in OGD's Office of Regulatory Operations. Looks like we do have some questions coming in. The first group of questions will be directed to Robert Gaines. And here's the first question for Captain Gaines. When should we contact the RPM, and what is the difference between the RPM and the RBPM?
Thank you for the question. So I'll start with the latter part, the difference between the RPM and the RBPM. The RBPM is the OPQ's project manager, and they oversee the quality assessment for all the disciplines that OPQ houses. The RPM is the overall application PM and the Office of Generic Drugs. The two groups and individuals in those groups work closely together. So the RBPM would be your point of contact for all quality-related disciplines and or communications. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We do have another question that came in from Captain Gaines, and here's the question. If an extension is granted to respond to a DRL, will it impact the GDUFA goal date of an ANDA?
So that's a good question. Thank you for asking that. So the extension requests that we receive, we do consider the amount of time that is being requested, the amount of issues that were communicated in the DRL, and our ability to perform that assessment within the existing review clock. So it's a very unlikely scenario that we would grant an extension request that would put us at risk for missing the review clock. It is possible, but very unlikely.
Thank you for responding to that question. Moving on to our next panelist, we have a few questions that came in for Lieutenant Warren Simmons, and here is the first question. Can unsolicited information be submitted in the response to the CRL, or should it be submitted as a separate amendment?
All right, thank you for that question. Yes, unsolicited information can be submitted in a CRL response. However, please keep in mind that the response will receive a review goal date consistent with the goal dates outlined in the GDUFA 2 commitment letter and described in the amendments guidance. So in this case, or if a CRL was issued as minor and the unsolicited information is considered major, the goal date assigned will be that of a major amendment, but the information can be submitted with the CRL. And just make sure when you do submit that it is highlighted that that new information is included. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We do have another question for Lieutenant Simmons, and here's the question. With regard to deferred submissions, if a GDUFA goal date is approaching and an applicant would like to submit an amendment, can it be automatically assumed that the amendment will be deferred and not reviewed during the current review cycle?
Also, another great question. It is not guaranteed that an amendment will automatically be deferred just because the goal date is approaching. That determination will be up to the agency's discretion and as well as the respective review team. And that's based on the content of the amendment as well as the resources and time required for review, in addition to the timeline. So while the goal date is a factor, it isn't the only factor and doesn't particularly indicate whether an amendment will be deferred. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. Moving on to our next panelist, we have a few questions that came in for Dr. Peter Enos, and here is the first question. Will 20% chromatograms be sufficient, or do we need to submit 100%?
Thank you for that question. This is actually a really good question because we've had this question asked a couple of times, but essentially 20% chromatograms will be sufficient. You do not need to submit 100% chromatograms, although some applicants choose to do this, and that's perfectly acceptable. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We do have another question for Dr. Enos, and here's the next question. Are half-tablet dissolution studies always required for modified release tablet products, for example, even when there is no scoring and the tablets are not intended to be split?
Thank you for that question. Once again, this is a very good question. And the short answer to that is the modified release tablets, as long as there's no scoring, then half-tablet dissolution studies are not required. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. Moving on to our next panelist, we do have a couple of questions that came in for Lieutenant Commander Kim, Elizabeth Kim, and here is the first question. For parenteral drug products, can a Q1, Q2 formulation assessment controlled correspondence inquiry contain multiple fill volumes?
Thank you for that question. Per guidance of industry on controlled correspondence related to generic drug development published in December 2020, the agency recommends that formulation assessment for multiple drug products be submitted in separate controlled correspondences. This includes separate formulation assessment requests for drug products with multiple strength, such as parenteral drug products with different fill sizes, as each fill size strength is a separate drug product.
Thank you for responding to that question. We received another question for Lieutenant Commander Kim, and here's the question. Does the Division of Filing Review evaluate the active ingredient for Q1, Q2 formulation assessment in controlled correspondence?
Thank you for that question. DFR does not assess the active ingredient of the drug product during the review of Q1, Q2 evaluation. It should be noted that requests for Q1, Q2 evaluation of proposed formulations encompass only the inactive ingredients. Reference is made to the guidance for industry control correspondence related to generic drug development published in December 2020.
Thank you for responding to that question. Moving on to our next panelist, we received a few questions for Dr. Julia Lee, and here is the first question. If any product fails in accelerated conditions and also in intermediate conditions, can we still file the ANDA and support our application shelf life with real-time stability data?
Hello. Thank you for that question. Applicants can choose to use an approach other than those set forth in the guidance document, i.e. the accelerated and accelerated and intermediate data. However, the alternative approach must satisfy the relevant statutory and regulatory requirements. Therefore, the stability data should support the proposed shelf life in the ANDA submission.
Thank you for responding to that question. We have another question for Dr. Lee, and here's the question. What is the course of action when the inactive ingredient database does not list the inactive ingredient that is contained within the RLD, or it is not listed under the dosage form or route of administration?
Thank you for that question. So an applicant can choose to submit a control correspondence requesting the agency's guidance on the inactive ingredient that is being proposed along with the amount and the route of administration, or the applicant can provide complete pharmacology and toxicology information of the inactive ingredient in the ANDA submission.
Thank you for responding to that question. We received one more question for Dr. Lee, and here is the question. How can an applicant prevent the creation of duplicate documents or files when responding to information requests?
Thank you for that question. An applicant should ensure that the correct operation attribute is used to retain the most current files and avoid issues with duplicate documents. This was presented during Peter's presentation. Duplicate documents can potentially delay the receipt of an ANDA. If you have any questions about your electronic submission, we recommend that you reach out to CDER ESUP.
Thank you for responding to that question. Moving back to the top of the panel, we have another question for Captain Robert Gaines, and here is the question. What should we do if the RBPM is not as responsive as we would like, or they are not providing the level of feedback we are seeking?
Thank you for that question. That's a good question. I'll say the first thing is that the RBPMs, they provide the level of feedback that they're able to, and that's most appropriate given the status of the application. Providing anything more than what they do, there are many items that are subject to change while the assessment is ongoing. So it would not be in the best interest of either party for us to give even what, may seem to be a preliminary recommendation. Regarding responsiveness, we do have a level of expectation for our staff to be responsive. That said, oftentimes there is coordination happening where they are seeking information to be able to provide back as much as possible. So if responsiveness is an issue and or you are not satisfied with the level of information that you have received from the RBPMs, you could elevate it. Now, I mention this because we often get inquiries that go from I don't know how better to word it. I'll say from 0 to 100, for example, you know, the RBPM all the way up to our super office director, Dr. Kapcha. I would prefer, it would be most ideal for those inquiries that are elevated to go to the next level in the organization, which would be the branch chief and then the division director and then myself, the deputy office director, and then we have a office director for OPRO. So essentially, the chain of command in OPRO would be ideal in terms of elevating these inquiries or the status updates if you need more than what's been provided. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. Well, it looks like we're just out of time, and it gives me just a few moments to thank all of our presenters and panelists for answering numerous questions that came in. We'll now go into our next presentations. The first presentation is on project management of pre-market and post-market generic drug safety. Our presenter, Tu Van Lambert, is a Senior Regulatory Health Project Manager in OGD's Division of Clinical Safety and Surveillance, where she provides regulatory affairs and project management oversight and coordination for multidisciplinary teams of scientists, clinicians, and specialists on broad pre-market and post-market generic drug safety and surveillance activities for OGD. Following this, our next presentation before the Q&A panel will be on the best practices for conducting comparative analyses in ANDAs. Our presenter, Commander Andrew Fine, is a Senior Advisor in OGD's Office of Safety and Clinical Evaluation, Division of Clinical Review. As part of the division management, Commander Fine provides clinical, regulatory, and process oversight for ANDAs and pre-ANDA activities in the division. Prior to his role as Senior Advisor, Commander Fine served as a team leader in the division for 7 years. Please welcome our first presenter, Tu Van Lambert.
Hello. Thank you for joining me on my presentation on project management of pre-market and post-market generic drug safety. My name is Tu Van Lambert. I am a regulatory health project manager in the Division of Clinical Safety and Surveillance in the Office of Generic Drugs. In my presentation, I will describe collaborative approaches and the RHPM's role in managing generic drug safety issues across OGD and CDER. I will describe the Regulatory Health Project Manager, or RHPM's, perspective regarding clinical reviews of serious adverse events from pre-market bioequivalence in bioavailability, or BABE studies. I will also introduce the newly identified safety signal, or NIS, map, and the role of the RHPM in DCSS in this post-market safety process. I would like to start my presentation by highlighting the organizations involved in generic drug safety issues. Drug safety is a CDER priority, and OGD plays a role in CDER's post-market safety efforts as it impacts generic drug safety. OGD engages with collaborators across CDER on their drug safety efforts, working with experts in various drug safety review disciplines, including pharmacovigilance and medication errors experts from the Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology, chemists from the Office of Pharmaceutical Quality on product quality issues that impact drug safety, clinicians from the Office of New Drugs on therapeutic class-specific product issues, brand or generic drugs, and experts in the Drug Safety Operations Group in the Center Director's Office on oversight and strategic direction. There are also CDER-wide drug safety efforts through regular collaboration activities, including those relevant not just to issues on a specific generic drug product, but also on broader drug safety issues impacting generic drug safety. Specific collaboration forums that touches on generic drug safety include the Drug Risk Management Board, where generic drug safety issues are elevated to CDER leadership levels, The OGD Clinical Safety and Surveillance Committee charged with overseeing generic drug safety activities or issues with relevant CDER offices such as OPQ and OSC, and other CDER-wide efforts to support and modernize drug safety review. As shown in the cover image I included here, the CDER's Drug Safety Priorities 2021 report highlights the Center's drug safety-related accomplishments and milestones to include those specific to generic drugs. Within OGD, various offices and divisions within may participate in generic drug safety activities when appropriate. The Division of Clinical Safety and Surveillance, or DCSS, serves as the organizational point of contact in OGD related to clinical safety and surveillance activities on generic drug safety. While DCSS leads in generic drug safety issues, it is critical that they work within the OGD organization as well as with those in CDER as previously described. Collaboration with OGD offices and divisions may include issue-specific ones such as consults or broader generic drug safety activities impacting multiple OGD offices. The division works in close collaboration with other groups in OSCE and OGD as described in this slide. This slide illustrates where the DCSS fits within the OGD organizational structure. Within OGD is the Office of Safety and Clinical Evaluation, or OSCE, and within OSCE is DCSS. The point I would like to make with this slide is that while the DCSS is within tiers of the CDER and OGD organization, DCSS routinely engages beyond the division and with the OGD and CDER organizations. In DCSS, the staff of experts are organized into 3 teams as shown in this slide. DCSS are a multidisciplinary staff of experts that includes physicians, pharmacists, nurses, epidemiologists, and other scientists who perform broad generic drug clinical safety and surveillance activities. As I highlight where in this chart you can find the RHPM, this illustrates the role of the RHPM in providing support for the 3 teams in DCSS, as well as to the director and the deputy director. I'd like to note that the clinical team is the focus of DCSS review activities on generic drug safety submissions I will describe later in my presentation. As outlined in this slide, the RHPM in DCSS is responsible for review management coordination and communication activities within DCSS as well as with those in OGD and CDER. The DCSS RHPM is also responsible for preparing and conveying communication with industry and other stakeholders as appropriate. So up to this point, I described the DCSS organization and the role of its RHPM. So now I will describe the work the DCSS does and the role of the DCSS RHPM to support that work. To start, safety issues can arise for generic drugs anytime, before submission of an abbreviated new drug application, or ANDA, or after its approval. For this presentation, I will use the term pre-market for issues occurring before an ANDA is approved, and post-market for those occurring after ANDA approval. In DCSS, we review reports of potential safety issues that occur throughout this time. In the pre-market space, or prior to ANDA approval, DCSS plays a role in evaluating safety issues occurring during BA/BE studies that support generic drug development. DCSS may review for the impact of clinical safety of reports of serious adverse events or adverse events that occur during the conduct of these studies. I will discuss this in a later slide. Specific pre-market submissions in DCSS reviews include bio-INDs and pre-market SAEs. In my presentation, bio-INDs are defined as INDs for BA/BE studies. Pre-market SAEs are defined as reports of expedited serious adverse events in IND-exempt BABE studies. The regulations outline submission requirements for sponsors conducting BABE studies that require the submission of a bio-IND. Additional information on these submission requirements under 21 CFR 320.31 are covered in another presentation in the Generic Drug Forum. For a bio-IND submitted to the FDA, DCSS serves as a review discipline in a team of reviewers to include those in OGDs, DFR, and OB, as well as in OPQ. Specifically, the Division of Filing Review, or DFR, triages the submission, then the submission is reviewed in the appropriate review disciplines. The DCSS RHPM coordinates review management of clinical safety reviews of bio-INDs and coordinates with DFR on communications, including review status updates and information requests to bio-IND sponsors. DCSS provides the clinical safety review of bio-INDs. DCSS provides clinical safety assessments in bio-INDs when, upon initial submission, as part of the multidisciplinary 30-day review to determine that studies conducted under this bio-IND are safe to proceed, and subsequently in reports submitted to the FDA under the bio-IND of any safety issues that may arise during conduct of the studies under that bio-IND. Safety issues can arise during the conduct of BABE studies, studies conducted under a bio-IND, as well as in IND-exempt BABE studies. The regulations describe the requirements for submission of these reports of adverse events that occur during the conduct of BABE studies. For bio-INDs, safety reports must be submitted for serious, unexpected, suspected adverse events, most likely related to the study drug. For IND-exempt BABE studies, safety reports must be submitted for all serious adverse events. Please refer to the appropriate regulations and guidance specifying the safety reports that must be submitted to the FDA of serious adverse events occurring in a BABE study. The DCSS RHPM manages the clinical safety review of these safety reports, both under the bio-IND and submitted as a pre-market SAE. Regarding communications, the DCSS RHPM would either coordinate with DFR on communications to bio-IND sponsors or contact sponsors directly for those who submitted pre-market SAEs. Currently, DCSS receives pre-market SAEs directly from sponsors or investigators via email, but we hope in the future these will be electronically submitted formally to the FDA. So I'm going to pause my presentation to introduce the first challenge question of my presentation. So, which review discipline does the DCSS RHPM coordinate review activities for bio-INDs? A, bioequivalence, B, clinical safety, C, filing, or D, product quality. I will give you a few moments to review the question and select your answer. The correct answer is B. While bioequivalence, filing, and product quality review disciplines are part of the bio-IND review team, the DCSS manages the clinical safety discipline reviews. So DCSS's clinical safety and surveillance work continues after the ANDA is approved. In this post-market space, OGD continues to monitor and evaluate generic drug safety after approval as the generic drug product is available for sale in the U.S. market. When safety issues emerge at this time, these issues are reported to the FDA for review. In DCSS, specific safety submissions we assess include health hazard evaluations, or HHEs, and newly identified safety signals, or NIS. I will go into details on these submissions in the next slides. So, what is a health hazard evaluation, or HHE? An HHE is a tool for CDER's Office of Compliance for classifying a voluntary recall by a firm. The recall classification guides FDA in determining the risk to the public from the defective product and appropriate actions for the firm and the FDA to take to protect public health. For an HHE, on behalf of OGD, DCSS's clinical safety assessment relates the product defect described in the HHE to its impact on clinical safety. The DCSS RHPM provides review assignment oversight, coordination, and communication support for these HHEs, including managing consults to other disciplines to support clinical safety assessment of the HHE. Another post-market submission DCSS works on is the newly identified safety signal, or NIS. NISs are potential safety issues such as serious adverse events, medication errors, or adverse events that suggest therapeutic inequivalence or quality issue that warrant further investigation. Considerations for DCSS participation can include safety issues such as tablets breaking apart, precipitates observed in oral liquids or injectables, a suspected contamination, patches not sticking, or other related safety issues. The NIS map describes in detail what a NIS is, the NIS review, and the roles and responsibilities in CDER for a NIS. This slide describes roles in the NIS process where OGD may serve. DCSS serves as the signatory authority for OGD on NISs when a potential safety issue relates to an ANDA. DCSS can serve as the safety lead on issues specific to generic drug quality or manufacturing issues or as part of a generic drug device combination product. The DCSS RHPM can serve as the NIS project manager when OGD serves as the safety lead or the signatory authority. In any case, in participating in the NIS process, DCSS collaborates with other disciplines in CDER as part of the multidisciplinary NIS process. The NIS process is an example of a post-market collaboration activity for DCSS to engage in. For a NIS, DCSS may collaborate with other CDER disciplines, such as issue-specific NIS meetings that include a multidisciplinary review team, or in cross-cutting meetings, such as the OGD Clinical Safety and Surveillance Committee, where these type issues may be discussed as part of a broader oversight and coordination efforts in CDER. So at this point, I will introduce the second challenge question to my presentation. So when would DCSS be the signatory authority to a NIS according to the NIS map? A, safety issues for a class of drug products. B, safety issues for an active ingredient. C, when a safety issue relates to a biosimilar. Or D, when a safety issue relates to a specific generic drug. I will give you a few moments to review the question and select your answer. The correct answer is D, when a safety issue relates to a specific generic drug. I've included in this slide links to resources to provide you additional information on topics I've discussed in my presentation. So in summary, the DCSS is responsible for providing expertise in the clinical safety assessment of generic drug safety issues. These generic drug safety efforts require coordination beyond the division and with other groups in OGD, CDER, and even with industry as needed. With this broad-reaching activities, the DCSS RHPM perspective is also broad in scope with respect to the review process and organizational interactions involved in addressing generic drug safety. This perspective is critical to provide effective support in collaboration, management, and communication. for those looking for generic drug safety expertise in DCSS. The DCSS RHPM serves as that primary contact for the division to collaborators or to industry on relevant generic drug safety efforts on which DCSS is involved in. So that concludes my presentation. I hope that from my presentation you have gained interest and appreciation to the breadth and depth of work of DCSS and the role of its RHPMs to support that work. Thank you for your time, and I may address your questions in the question and answer panel.
Good afternoon. My name is Commander Andrew Fine. I am a Senior Advisor in the Division of Clinical Review in the Office of Safety and Clinical Evaluation in OGD. My talk today is titled Best Practices for Conducting Comparative Analyses in ANDAs. At the end of my presentation, participants should be able to provide key principles for conducting comparative analyses, review user interface considerations for specific categories of products, and discuss tips for user interface assessment during product development. To begin, I want to focus on foundational principles and regulatory framework for comparative analyses and generic drug-device combination products in ANDAs. First, when comparing to the RLD, ANDAs need to demonstrate therapeutic equivalence and that the product can be expected to have the same clinical effect and safety profile when administered to patients under the conditions specified in labeling. These same expectations apply for generic combination products, and specifically whether end users can use the generic combination product when it is substitute for the RLD without the intervention of the healthcare professional and/or without additional training prior to the use of the generic product. Note, the generic and RLD products do not need to be identical, as long as the differences do not preclude approval under an abbreviated new drug application. The comparative analysis provide a framework to assess the user interface, but the regulatory context is related to the individual RLD. The comparison of the proposed user interface of the generic drug-device combination product is compared to that user interface of the RLD. All relevant determinations of sameness under 505J are made with respect to the RLD. When the RLD information is unavailable, performing the comparison to the RLD may be challenging, but is still required. This slide summarizes the types of drug-device combination products submitted in ANDAs. The pie chart on the left is broken into segments, with the larger segment representing a larger percentage of that product type. From this pie chart, injectable and oral products make up over 2/3 of all combination products submitted under ANDAs. I will focus on these two categories later on when discussing common deficiencies and design tips. The draft guidance for industry, published in 2017, describes the recommended approach to comparative analyses under ANDAs. I will detail major components of this guidance in the following slides. First, I will begin with key definitions. First, an external critical design attribute. These are features that directly affect how users perform a critical task that is necessary in order to use or administer the drug product. These critical tasks are user tasks that, if performed incorrectly or not performed at all, would or could cause harm to the patient or user, where harm is defined and includes compromised care. There are three main comparisons, and within each comparison, it is important to consider and include all components with which the end users interact. The three comparisons, which I will go into further detail in the next two slides, are the physical comparison, the comparative task analysis, and the labeling comparison. First, for the physical comparison. This includes visual, auditory, tactile examination of the physical features of the RLD delivery device. This includes features such as size, shape, color, texture, weight, thickness, and sound. Next, compare the features to those of the proposed generic product. Components with which the end users do not interact should not be included in the physical comparison. For applicants submitting comparative analysis, and according to the draft guidance for industry, you should provide information comparing physical features of the delivery device constituent part of the RLD to those of the proposed generic combination product. In your submission, you should include clear, detailed, and color photographs of both your product and the RLD. In your physical comparison, you should identify and provide adequate justification for all differences in the delivery constituent parts. Next, moving to the comparative task analysis, applicants should systematically analyze and compare the sequential activities required for the end users to use the device and administer the drug product. This should include all steps end users need to perform to use the drug product. For example, from opening the packaging to disposing of the drug product, all steps from start to finish. Lastly, the labeling comparison. Applicants should use the current version of the RLD label, ensure that labeling, including the instructions for use or IFU and images, accurately describes the proposed generic product. Verify that labeling, including the IFU, accurately describes all tasks necessary for the proposed product. Remember, the labeling should also include the tasks that differ from the RLD, or that may differ from the RLD. When performing the physical, task, and labeling comparisons, there are three outcomes of the comparative analyses. These are no difference, minor design difference, and other design differences. All these differences identified should be considered within the context of the overall risk profile of the product. A minor design difference is if the difference in the user interface of the proposed product in comparison to the user interface of the RLD do not affect an external critical design attribute. Alternatively, an other design difference would be an aspect of the comparative analysis that suggests that the difference in design between the proposed generic product and the RLD may impact an external critical design attribute. When assessing these identified differences, you should identify and provide adequate justification for all user interface differences in the comparative analyses, and focus on potential differences in the critical tasks between the RLD and the generic drug device combination product. And finally, consider the context of use, which will be defined on the next slide. The context of use, which is incorporated into that assessment of identified differences, includes the urgency of use, emergent versus non-emergent, the frequency of use, whether it's single use or chronic or repeated use. Who is the end user? Is it administered by patients or caregivers or exclusively by healthcare professionals? Where is the product administered? Is it an inpatient clinical setting, or is it a non-clinical setting, such as a home or school? And finally, who is the intended patient population for this product? May they have underlying diseases that may impact the use of the product? For example, if they have dexterity issues, or if the end user is incapacitated, such as naloxone use. Taking into account the user interface comparison, the comparative analyses, and the related assessment, I will now go through common deficiencies and oral dosing syringes for drug-device combination products. As discussed at the opening, this is a major product type of combination products submitted as ANDA. The first example depicts incorrect orientation of dose markings. Because the RLD instructions direct the user to invert the bottle to withdraw the dose, the selected syringe displayed here will have inverted dose markings, and this difference compared to the RLD may lead to dose measurement errors due to these inverted markings. The next example is extraneous markings. The proposed syringe contains milliliter, ml markings and teaspoon or TSP markings. The RLD labeling describes the dosing in mLs only, and inclusion of the extraneous teaspoon markings on the displayed syringes may lead to dosing errors where a 1 ml dose could be measured erroneously as 1 teaspoon or 5 mLs. This would lead to a 5 times overdose. Lastly, inadequate contrast is a common deficiency. There should be adequate contrast between the product and the device. As seen on the left picture, the plunger tip includes a black rubber ring to help align the correct dose when the liquid is white. In contrast, and as visible on the right picture, without a black ring, there is inadequate contrast between the white liquid and the white plunger, which could lead to dosing errors due to this inadequate contrast. This slide summarizes the examples on the previous slide and converts them into design tips to avoid some of these common deficiencies. As a reminder, when I refer to oral dosing devices, I am primarily referring to dosing devices like dosing cups, oral syringes, and oral droppers that are co-packaged with the drug product. It's recommended to minimize the differences from the RLD in dispensing devices. Notably, remove extraneous markings, ensure correct orientation of markings, remove trailing zeros, and ensure that the dispensing device can measure the exact dose or doses that are recommended in the label. Next, I will discuss complex issues and common deficiencies for injectable products, another subset of frequent drug-device combination products. The first injectable drug-device combination product I will discuss are pre-filled syringes. These products can be healthcare or patient-administered. They include multiple routes of administration, such as subcutaneous, intravenous, or intramuscular. These are either pre-assembled with a needle, or the end user must attach the needle prior to administration. The RLD for these products is also provided as a pre-filled syringe, or the RLD could be an ampule vial for injection. And finally, pre-filled syringes are usually the least complicated injectable combination products. The next device combination products are injection kits. These products are usually healthcare professional administered, but can also be patient administered, as you will see during the case example. Assembly and reconstitution is often required by the healthcare professional or the end user prior to administration. Injection kits are used in a variety of clinical settings and include emergency and non-emergency use. To better understand the comparative analysis approach for a pre-filled syringe, let's consider a hypothetical pre-filled syringe. The RLD needle is on the left and the hypothetical on the right. Let's discuss a few characteristics of the RLD. First, the pre-filled syringe is for emergency use. After connecting the needle, it is self-injected by the patient. What if a generic applicant proposes a needle safety guard, which is pictured on the right? The safety guard is used to cover the needle after injection. This differs from the RLD that does not have a safety guard. Remember, this product is for emergency use, and this design is problematic, as the patient could unknowingly cover the needle prior to injection, locking it in place, which would delay or prevent administration. Because the RLD doesn't contain a safety guard, this type of treatment delay or failure is not possible. And as a result, this difference in design would be considered an other design difference, as it may potentially affect an external critical design attribute that involves administration, clinical use, and performance when substituted for the RLD. Also, additional training may be required prior to the use of the generic combination product when substituted for the RLD. For the injection kit case study, let's consider an RLD kit that's pictured here. This is an emergency use product administered by the patient or caregiver. And to highlight a few of the administration steps or critical tasks, we will understand what design considerations will take into consideration for a proposed generic. So for the RLD product, first you must remove the needle cover, insert the needle into the vial, remove the needle to reconstitute the solution, and then insert the same syringe to withdraw the liquid. Remember that these product characteristics and administration steps should be understood when designing a generic product. As an example, what if a proposed product had a significantly shorter plunger length, which would make it more difficult to grasp the syringe to withdraw the drug prior to injection? Since the design difference should be assessed according to the context of use, this product is emergency use, and the end user is a patient and not a healthcare provider trained in a variety of injectable products. Therefore, this would be considered an other design difference. And the applicant would need to redesign their product to minimize these differences. Or alternatively, the applicant could provide comparative use data. Now I want to share other common deficiencies not previously discussed. These include situations when the instructions for use do not accurately represent the proposed test product, or images and labeling do not represent the product. Also, if dose measurement markings don't correspond to doses recommended in prescribement information and differs from the RLD markings, this would be an other design difference, and applicants would be asked to redesign their product. The next few slides describe C8 comparative analysis tips for any drug product. First, design differences are product-specific and must be analyzed within the context of comparison to the RLD. If the RLD is discontinued or unavailable, it's recommended to submit a controlled correspondence or a pre-ANDA meeting prior to development. Always use the to-be-marketed generic drug combination product in your comparative analyses. To continue with these tips, incorporate the recommendations in the draft guidance regarding comparative analyses. And where able, design the generic product to minimize differences in the user interface and those critical tasks compared to the RLD. Perform comparative analyses throughout the development program, especially if changes are made. And finally, engage early with FDA during the product development via controlled correspondence or pre-ANDA. Submit comparative analyses, the samples of the product, and specific questions in that pre-ANDA communication. If an other design difference is present, discuss these differences early with FDA. Include your proposal of additional information or data to assess the acceptability of the differences, and submit specific questions with your proposal. In order to test your knowledge, there are two challenge questions to round up my presentation. Question 1. The physical comparison includes visual, auditory, tactile examination of the physical features of the proposed product compared to the RLD. I'll give you a few more moments to answer this question. The correct answer is true. The physical comparison does include visual, auditory, tactile examination of the physical features. In question 2, when assessing differences between your proposed product and the RLD, applicants should consider the context of use that includes A, urgency of use, B, frequency of use, C, environment of use, D, patient population, or E, all of the above? I'll give you a moment to answer challenge question number 2. The correct answer is E, all of the above. In summary, comparative analyses best practices include: refer to the draft comparative analyses guidance with complete recommendations. All design differences should be identified, adequately analyzed, and scientifically justified. Focus on potential differences in the critical tasks between the RLD and the generic product. Consider the context of use of the product. Engage early with FDA during your product development. Submit controlled correspondence for these specific questions. And finally, proposed complex products may be eligible for FDA advice via the pre-ANDA meetings. I thank you for your time and look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you both for the great presentations. We'll now transition into our questions and panel discussion. If you haven't had a chance to enter your questions into the Q&A chat pod, please do so now. We'll answer as many questions as time allows. The first group of questions is directed to Dr. Tuvan Lambert, and here's the first question for Dr. Lambert. When does DCSS issue an information request for more information for pre-market SAEs?
Thank you for the question. DCSS usually requests information that was not originally submitted in the pre-market SAEs. We request as much information as available to be included in the submission. Information such as study protocol, medical records, and other reports may be included. This information is helpful for assessing clinical safety of serious adverse events, especially when the event when events like a death is likely to occur. Complete and timely information is helpful for timely and complete assessment of clinical safety of the SAE. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for responding to that question. The next question for Dr. Lambert is the following. How long does a sponsor or investigator have to respond to an information request for a pre-market SAE?
Thank you for that question. The regulations state the required time frame during which the sponsor or investigator has to respond to an information request. We request as much information as available to be included in submission to the agency in a timely manner. Complete and timely information is helpful for timely and complete assessment of clinical safety of the serious adverse event. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We do have another question for Dr. Lambert, and this is the question. Is it mandatory for generic drug manufacturers to perform scientific literature search for any adverse event and submit them to the FDA along with their AE reports?
Thank you again for that question. Complete information related to serious adverse events should be submitted to OGD to allow for timely and complete assessment of said SAE by OGD. This may include the results of a literature search, but OGD does not require that the results of literature searches be submitted for all serious adverse events reported to OGD. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that group of questions. Moving on to our next panelist, we do have a few questions that came in for Commander Andrew Fine. And here's the first question for Commander Fine. If one strength of the RLD is discontinued and not commercially available in this case, what should a generic strength be compared to?
Thank you for that question, and good afternoon, everybody. This is a very timely question, as this is a frequently asked question for many applicants developing generic drug combination products. The generic product relies upon the determination of safety and efficacy of the RLD product, and the proposed product should be compared to the RLD. The reference standard, which also often comes up within this context, is only used for the in vivo bioequivalence testing. So for this situation raised by this question, if the RLD is discontinued and or unavailable, that comparison still needs to be made to the RLD, but we do recommend submitting a controlled correspondence or pre-ANDA meeting request to discuss an alternative approach with the agency for your situation. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We do have another question for Commander Fine, and here is the question. What about markings for dosages on a device such as ml or mg? Are these considered a physical comparison of a comparative task analysis?
Thank you for this question. So during the presentation, I clearly outlined the steps and the definitions and the recommendations to how to conduct each of these three analyses: the physical comparison, the comparative task analysis, and the labeling comparison. For markings that are directly on the device itself, such as mLs or milligrams, these should first be identified during that physical comparison. Acknowledging and evaluating that there is a difference in those devices on a proposed product versus the RLD. When it comes to the comparative task analysis, it's important to understand that during that comparative task analysis, assessment, and comparison, how these differences in that physical device can influence and impact the sequential tasks necessary to complete it. So for example, the accurate measuring of the product would be a key task for that product, and really in your comparative analysis to evaluate how these different markings will influence that task of measuring the product and what differences exist in your situation or your product compared to the RLD. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We have another question for Commander Fine, and here's the question. Can you share some examples for minor design differences and other differences in design?
Thank you for this question. And in these forums, we're frequently asked to, give more general advice. And, this is exactly under that kind of umbrella. And I'll give some general advice, but I will frame it with a disclaimer. Because remember that when we categorize differences, they always need to be compared to that individual RLD to evaluate if those differences may impact a critical task, and specifically understanding the RLD's context of use, its indications, its end users, and some of the other examples I shared in my presentation. So generalizing a specific difference for one product may not apply to a different product with a different RLD, because it really will rely on that separate individualized comparison to that RLD. But with that caveat, in generally physical geometry, size and shape of containers with very negligible differences, such as millimeter differences, would generally be minor differences as long as those differences won't impact a critical task. And as you saw in my presentation with that injection product, those were not negligible differences in the dimensions of the product. Those shorter plunger length impacted a critical task and would allow such a difference to be considered an other design difference. Additionally, color is often a minor difference, but again, it depends if any tasks are associated with that color. So for example, if there's an auto injector where the instructions are to push the blue button, and that's an emergency use product, if a proposed product had a yellow button, that likely would confuse the end user, and would be likely considered an other design difference. So even though color may generally be a minor difference, again, I can't understate the importance of
making those comparisons to that RLD product and understanding and evaluating those differences and how they affect those external critical design attributes, those critical tasks, and individuating those comparisons for every RLD that a proposed device is being developed and compared to. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We just have about 1 minute left before our break, and we want to thank both of our presenters and panelists for answering numerous questions that came in. We'll now enter into our